Have you ever wondered what happens when a racist manager crosses the wrong employee? Jamal Lawson stood at the entrance of Summit Solutions Group, the gleaming corporate tower looming overhead. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, before stepping inside. Today was the start of his internship, one that he had worked hard for and deserved. But there was no denying the weight of the unspoken challenge that came with being a young black man in a predominantly white corporate space. As the elevator ascended to the 23rd floor, Jamal reminded himself that no one here knew who he really was, the son of David Lawson, the CEO. He had kept that detail to himself. He wasn't here to coast on his father's name. This was about proving his worth. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a bustling office. At the center of it all stood Gary Thompson, the regional manager who would be supervising Jamal. Gary was tall, broad-shouldered, with thinning hair and a smug grin that seemed to ooze superiority. His sharp eyes raked over Jamal the moment he stepped out of the elevator. Gary walked over, not bothering to hide the disdain in his eyes. He didn't even extend his hand. Get ready to discover the shocking twist that will leave this manager reeling. So, Jamal Lawson, Gary said, his voice dripping with mockery, they finally got themselves a diversity hire, huh? Or maybe it's because you have the same last name as the CEO. He chuckled, completely unaware of who Jamal really was. Jamal blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness. Excuse me? Gary chuckled darkly, as if Jamal had told a joke. Come on, kid, you really think you're here because of your resume? Let's be real, corporate's been talking a lot about diversity initiatives. Guess you're what they came up with. Jamal felt his chest tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. I earned my place here. Gary raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. Sure, that's what they all say. He turned on his heel. Let's get this over with. I'll show you where you'll be working. Jamal followed in silence, anger simmering beneath the surface. He had dealt with people like Gary before, people who assumed that his success had nothing to do with his abilities and everything to do with filling a quota, but today he wasn't going to give Gary the satisfaction of a reaction. Gary led him through the office at a brisk pace, not bothering to explain much. When they passed a few employees, Gary barely acknowledged them, but Jamal could feel the eyes on him. Some glanced curiously, others quickly looked away. He could almost hear the whispers. You'll be here, Gary said, stopping abruptly at a small, cramped cubicle tucked away in a corner. Not the best spot, but hey, you got to start somewhere, right? Hopefully you can keep up. Wouldn't want to waste everyone's time. Jamal's jaw clenched, but he gave a polite nod. I'll do my best. Gary smirked, leaning against the cubicle wall, arms crossed. We'll see about that. Last guy who worked under me didn't last long, but then again, he didn't have the same advantages as you. Jamal glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Gary shrugged, feigning innocence, just saying, you're part of the company's new push, right? People like you, they're all about giving you opportunities these days. His grin widened, a smug look of superiority etched across his face. Let's see if you can handle it without getting special treatment. Jamal met Gary's gaze steadily. I'm not here for special treatment. Gary chuckled, clearly enjoying the power he thought he held. Sure you're not. Well, you've got today to prove it. Better get to work. Without another word, Gary walked off, leaving Jamal standing at his new desk. The sting of the encounter still lingered. Jamal sat down, opened his laptop, his mind racing. He had dealt with plenty of subtle racism in his life, but Gary wasn't even trying to be subtle, and the worst part, Gary thought he could get away with it because he assumed Jamal had no real power here. But Gary didn't know the truth, not yet. The day dragged on with Gary looming over Jamal at every turn. Every time Jamal handed in a piece of work, Gary found a reason to belittle him. Jamal, this report, Gary said at one point, standing over Jamal's desk, tapping a stack of papers against his palm. Did you even read the instructions? This is sloppy. You're going to need to pick up the pace if you want to last here. Jamal clenched his jaw. I'll fix it. Gary's smirk returned. Yeah, you will. Let me know when you've got it right. Don't want to fall behind the others, do you? By the others, Jamal knew exactly who Gary meant, the white interns who had already received far more patience and encouragement than Gary had offered him in these few short hours, but Jamal didn't let it show. He knew how to play the long game. Near the end of the day, Jamal had just finished revising his work when Gary strolled by, looking over the top of Jamal's cubicle with a sneer. Not bad for a diversity hire, Gary said. giving Jamal's revised report a cursory glance. Guess you're not completely hopeless. Jamal's hand tightened around his pen, but he kept his voice calm. Thanks, I'll keep that in mind. Gary snickered. Don't thank me yet, kid, you've got a long way to go, let's see if you can survive tomorrow. With that, Gary walked off, clearly enjoying his little power trip. Jamal watched him go, anger and determination swirling inside him. He had survived worse than Gary Thompson, he was here for a reason, and no racist bully was going to make him doubt that. Tomorrow he'd come back stronger, and Gary would keep pushing, but what Gary didn't know was that this wasn't just a job for Jamal, it was a test for both of them. As Jamal packed up and left the office, he felt the tension leave his body, but the fire in his chest remained. He wasn't here to make friends, he was here to prove something, and when the time came, Gary would have no idea what hit him. Over the next few weeks, Jamal's routine became a constant cycle of work, revision, and enduring Gary's relentless bullying. Each day, Gary found new ways to demean him, using every opportunity to remind Jamal that he was, in Gary's eyes, nothing more than a diversity hire. It was as if Gary had made it his personal mission to break Jamal, testing him every step of the way. Jamal had grown used to keeping his head down and focusing on his work. The more Gary pushed, the more determined Jamal became. He wasn't going to give in, he wasn't going to let Gary win. It was a Monday morning, and the office buzzed with the usual activity. Jamal sat at his desk, already deep into a project, when Gary strolled over with that familiar smirk plastered on his face. He dropped a thick stack of reports onto Jamal's desk with a thud, drawing the attention of a few nearby interns. Hope you've got some time today, Jamal, Gary said, his voice loud enough to ensure everyone could hear. I need these done by the end of the day. Let's see if you can manage that. Don't want to disappoint, right? Jamal glanced at the pile, then back at Gary. I'll get it done, he said calmly, refusing to rise to the bait. Gary leaned in, his smirk growing even more smug. Good, you might need to work twice as hard as the others though, don't want anyone thinking you're slacking off, considering why you're here. Jamal's hands tightened around the keyboard, he knew exactly what Gary was implying again. The other interns glanced at each other, but no one said a word. Jamal met Gary's gaze evenly. I've got it covered. Gary chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. That's the spirit, let's see if you can keep up with the real players here. He walked off, leaving Jamal with the weight of the extra work and the scrutiny of the other interns. Hours passed, and Jamal worked through the pile of reports meticulously, double-checking every detail. Gary hovered from time to time, throwing in casual jabs and criticisms, but Jamal kept his head down and pushed forward. He wasn't going to let Gary see him struggle. By mid-afternoon, Jamal had completed the bulk of the work when Gary reappeared, this time with a few of the other interns in tow. Gary glanced over Jamal's progress, then shook his head in exaggerated disappointment. Jamal, you're not done yet? Gary said loudly, making sure the others could hear. I thought you'd be faster than this by now. You don't want to hold everyone else up, do you? Jamal could feel the eyes on him, waiting, judging. He set his jaw, refusing to let the frustration show. I'm almost finished. Gary laughed, a cruel sound that echoed through the office. Almost doesn't count, Jamal. In this world, you've either got it or you don't. Let's hope you don't have to rely on excuses when you fall behind. The other interns shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Gary's words hung in the air like a challenge. Jamal looked up at him, his expression calm. I'll finish on time. Gary's smirk faltered for a split second, as if he hadn't expected Jamal to stay so composed. He nodded, clapping a hand on Jamal's shoulder with unnecessary force. Good, good, let's see if you can keep up then. As Gary walked away, the tension in the air slowly dissipated, but the damage had been done. Jamal could feel the silent judgment from the others, the whispers that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't up to the task. But Jamal had been underestimated before, and he had never backed down. By the end of the day, Jamal had completed the reports despite Gary's constant interruptions. He dropped the stack off on Gary's desk just as the office was starting to empty out. Gary glanced at the reports, flipping through a few pages. Not bad, he muttered, his tone begrudging. Guess you're not completely useless after all. Jamal didn't respond, knowing any acknowledgement would just give Gary more fuel to mock him. Better get used to this kind of workload, Jamal, Gary added, leaning back in his chair. If you want to make it here, you'll have to work harder than the others. People like you don't get the luxury of coasting by. Jamal stood there, fists clenched at his sides, every muscle tense. "I'm not here to coast." Gary smirked, as if enjoying Jamal's restrained anger. "We'll see, you've lasted longer than I expected, but we'll see how far you can really go." Jamal didn't give him the satisfaction of a reply. He turned and walked away, feeling the burn of Gary's words, but refusing to let them affect him. He had made it this far, and he wasn't going to let a racist bully like Gary break him. As the office emptied and Jamal packed up his things, he felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. Gary's bullying was relentless, and the pressure to constantly prove himself was exhausting, but Jamal knew what was at stake. He couldn't give up, not when there was so much riding on this. He had been playing the long game, keeping his connection to the CEO a secret for a reason. He didn't want special treatment, but at the same time, he knew the moment would come when Gary's behavior would catch up with him, and when it did, Gary wouldn't know what hit him. Jamal stepped into the elevator, the door sliding shut with a soft hiss. Tomorrow would be another day, another battle, but Jamal was ready for it, because he wasn't just here to survive, he was here to win. Jamal had grown accustomed to Gary's sneer and constant belittlement, but after weeks of enduring the hostility, he could feel the cracks in his own patience starting to widen. Gary had made it his mission to push Jamal as hard as he could, always implying that Jamal didn't belong, that his position was merely a result of some corporate diversity initiative. Despite everything, Jamal stayed focused on the job. He wasn't just going to survive here, he was going to excel, and Gary's bullying wasn't going to stop him. It was midweek, and the tension in the office seemed thicker than usual. There was a big client presentation coming up, and the entire team was on edge. Jamal had been tasked with preparing the data for the presentation, but as usual, Gary had found a way to make the situation harder. "Jamal!" Gary barked from across the room, causing heads to turn. He strode over to Jamal's desk, towering over him. "This is all wrong." Jamal looked up, confused. He had double-checked everything, knowing Gary would scrutinize it. "What's wrong with it?" Gary slammed the folder down on Jamal's desk, the sound reverberating through the office. "You didn't follow the structure I asked for. This is sloppy work." Jamal opened the folder, flipping through the pages. "I followed the outline you gave me, Garrett. If there's a mistake, I can." Gary cut him off, his voice dripping with mockery. "Oh, so it's my fault, is it? You think you can just pass the blame because you're not up to the task? Maybe that works where you're from, but here, you either get it right or you're out." The rest of the office fell silent, everyone pretending not to listen while clearly absorbing every word. Jamal felt the weight of their stares. "I'm not blaming anyone," Jamal said evenly. "I'll fix it if something needs adjusting." Gary's smirk deepened, his eyes gleaming with that familiar hateful satisfaction. "You better. This presentation is too important for you to screw up, and I'm not here to cover for anyone's incompetence." Jamal's blood boiled, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll fix it." Gary shook his head in mock disappointment. "You know, Jamal, it's almost like you're proving my point. They give someone like you a chance, and this is what we get." Jamal's jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. The thinly veiled racism wasn't even thin anymore. Gary wasn't trying to hide it. Jamal's fingers curled into fists under the desk, but he refused to let Gary see him crack. Hours later, as the office buzzed with last-minute preparations, Jamal sat at his desk, reworking the data. He could feel Gary's eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to fail. At one point, Gary walked by again, stopping briefly at Jamal's desk to make another snide comment. "Better make sure this is right, Jamal. You don't want to embarrass the team in front of the client. We've got enough eyes on us as it is, don't we?" Jamal looked up, meeting Gary's gaze. There was a fire behind his calm expression, but he kept his tone measured. "It'll be ready." Gary chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure it will." He walked off, leaving Jamal simmering. He wanted to say something, wanted to call Gary out for the racist bully that he was, but he knew now wasn't the time. He had to play this smart. His father's advice rang in his ears. Let them underestimate you, that's how you win. The next day, the big client presentation arrived. The conference room was filled with senior executives, Gary front and center, trying his best to play the role of a competent leader. Jamal sat toward the back, watching quietly as the presentation began. He had spent hours making sure every detail of the data was perfect, but he knew Gary would never give him credit for it. As the presentation unfolded, everything was running smoothly until one of the clients asked a particularly technical question about the data. Gary hesitated, clearly unsure of the answer, and glanced at his team. Jamal saw his opportunity. He stood up, addressing the client directly. Actually, I can explain that. All eyes turned to him as he approached the table, feeling the pressure of the room. Jamal explained the data clearly and concisely, walking the client through the finer points of the analysis. When he finished, the client nodded, satisfied, and several of the executives exchanged impressed glances. Gary, however, looked like he had swallowed a lemon. That's one way to look at it, Gary said, trying to regain control of the room. Good job, Jamal, I guess the extra work paid off. Jamal gave a polite nod, though he could see the fury simmering in Gary's eyes. Gary was furious, not just because Jamal had saved the presentation, but because he had done it in front of everyone, exposing Gary's own lack of preparation. After the meeting, Jamal returned to his desk, the adrenaline from the presentation still coursing through him. He had done his job well, and even though Gary would never admit it, he had proved himself. Later that afternoon, Gary stormed over to Jamal's desk, his face twisted in a forced smile. Don't think that little performance in there changes anything, Gary hissed. You might have impressed them, but I know the truth, you're still just a diversity hire. Jamal, you don't belong here. Jamal looked up, his expression calm, but his eyes hard. I belong here just as much as anyone else. Gary's smile faded into a sneer. We'll see about that, don't get too comfortable, you haven't earned anything yet. Jamal stood up, facing Gary head-on for the first time. I'm not going anywhere. For a brief moment, Gary's smug confidence wavered. He looked Jamal up and down, then turned and walked away without another word. Jamal sat back down, his hands trembling slightly. He knew Gary wouldn't stop, he would keep pushing, keep bullying, but today had been a victory, and there would be more. Gary's time was coming, and when the truth finally came out, Jamal would be the one standing tall, and Gary would be left in the dust. As the office emptied out for the day, Jamal stayed a little longer, reviewing his work. He had a plan, and no amount of bullying from Gary was going to derail it. He was playing the long game, and he was winning, because while Gary saw him as just a diversity hire, Jamal knew the truth, and when the moment was right, so would everyone else. Jamal arrived early the next morning, his focus sharpened after the previous day's presentation. He knew something had shifted. He had shown his worth in front of the executives, and Gary's facade had cracked, but Jamal also knew that Gary wasn't the type to back off easily. As he settled into his desk, Gary appeared, his face twisted into its usual smirk. Without a word, he dropped a stack of paperwork onto Jamal's desk. More work for you, Gary said with a forced grin. After your little performance yesterday, I'm curious to see if you can keep it up. Jamal didn't react. He glanced at the pile, recognizing it as busy work meant to overwhelm him. Gary was trying to push him to the edge, hoping to catch him slipping, but Jamal was prepared. He had faced worse than this before, and he knew how to stay focused. I'll get it done, Jamal said evenly, his tone giving nothing away. Gary leaned in, his voice dropping to a low hiss. You think you impressed everyone yesterday, don't you? Don't get too comfortable, you're still here because they needed to fill a quota. You don't belong here, and I'll make sure you realize that soon enough. Jamal kept his gaze steady, refusing to give Gary the reaction he wanted. I earned my place here, and you'll see that soon enough. Gary's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly, straightening up. We'll see about that. He walked away, leaving Jamal with the stack of pointless work. Jamal's mind raced, but he forced himself to focus on the task at hand. He couldn't afford to let Gary's words distract him. Later that afternoon, Jamal received a message on his phone. Meet me in the garage at 6 p.m. The message was from his father, David Lawson. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't spoken to his father directly since starting the internship. They had agreed to keep their relationship under wraps to allow Jamal to prove himself on his own terms, but now it seemed his father was ready to intervene. As the office began to empty, Jamal finished his work, grabbed his things, and made his way to the parking garage. The underground space was quiet, the hum of distant traffic the only sound. Jamal spotted his father's sleek black car parked in the far corner, and he approached with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. David Lawson stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable. He was a tall, imposing figure, dressed in a sharp suit, the weight of his authority palpable. Jamal could feel the tension between them as they stood face to face in the dimly lit garage. Dad, Jamal said quietly, unsure of where to begin. David nodded, his face remaining stoic. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, David spoke, "I've been watching." Jamal's heart pounded. He knew his father was always keeping an eye on the company, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach twist. "Gary," David said, his voice sharp, "has been testing you." Jamal nodded, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's more than testing, he's a bully, and he's not hiding his racism. Every day he makes it clear that he thinks I'm just here because of some diversity initiative." David's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "I know, and it's worse than I expected." Jamal hesitated, his mind racing. "So why haven't you done anything about it?" David sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Because I wanted to see how far he would go, I wanted to see how you would handle it." Jamal's frustration boiled over. "So you've just been watching me deal with this, letting him push me around, waiting for something to happen?" David held up a hand. "Jamal, you asked to do this on your own, you didn't want special treatment, I respected that." "I didn't ask for this," Jamal shot back. "I didn't ask to be bullied every day." David's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "And you've handled it better than I could have imagined, but now it's time to step in." Jamal took a breath, calming himself. "What are you going to do?" David looked at him, his gaze intense. "I've been gathering information on Gary, on his behavior, his performance, and his history. He's been on thin ice for a while, and this is the final straw, but I need you to be ready." Jamal frowned. "Ready for what?" "For the moment when I reveal who you really are," David said. Jamal froze. They had agreed to keep his identity as the CEO's son a secret to give him a chance to prove himself without the weight of his father's name hanging over him, but now it seemed that moment was coming to an end. "When?" Jamal asked quietly. David's expression hardened. "Soon, there's a board meeting coming up, and Gary's been pushing for a promotion. I'm going to let him believe he's about to get it, then when the time is right, I'll expose him." Jamal's heart raced. The thought of revealing his true identity in front of everyone, especially in front of Gary, was both exhilarating and terrifying. David placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I know this hasn't been easy, Jamal, but you've proven yourself, and soon everyone will know who you really are, and Gary will face the consequences of his actions." Jamal nodded, the weight of the moment settling over him. "I'm ready." David gave a small nod, his expression softening slightly. "Good, stay focused, and don't let him push you any further. When the time comes, you'll be the one standing tall." "Call me," David added, turning back for a moment. "I'm proud of you, you've shown real strength." Jamal's chest tightened, but he nodded. "Thanks, Dad." David got into his car and drove off, leaving Jamal standing alone in the dim light of the garage, his mind racing, the reality of what was about to happen sinking in. Everything was about to change. Soon Gary would be exposed for the bully he was, and when the truth came out, Jamal would be ready. He wasn't just an intern anymore, he was the son of the CEO, and soon everyone would know. The atmosphere in the office buzzed with anticipation as the board meeting approached. Jamal could feel the tension rising, but it wasn't just the usual pre-meeting nerves, there was something else in the air, something heavy. Gary had been strutting around the office all day, confidence radiating from him as he prepared for what he clearly believed would be his promotion. Jamal, on the other hand, knew that this meeting was more than just a stepping stone for Gary, it was the beginning of the end. The meeting was already underway when Jamal caught a glimpse of his father, David Lawson, in the conference room. David looked composed, talking animatedly with the executives, including Gary, who seemed eager to impress. Jamal stayed at his desk, keeping his focus on his work while trying not to think too much about the looming reveal. An hour later, the board meeting concluded, and Gary emerged from the room with a beaming smile, clearly satisfied with how things had gone. David followed shortly behind, his face unreadable as always. Jamal watched from his desk, noticing the brief eye contact his father made with him before turning his attention back to Gary. The two men stood in the hallway, chatting amiably. From a distance it looked like they were discussing company business, both of them relaxed, even jovial. Jamal knew better, his father was playing the long game, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As Jamal stood to gather his things, ready to leave for the day, he walked by the conference room. He wasn't planning on getting involved, but as he passed, David called out to him, "Jamal, come here for a second." Jamal hesitated for a brief moment, but quickly composed himself, walking over to where his father and Gary stood. Gary's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes, surprise, maybe even annoyance. David gestured to Jamal with a casual wave. "Gary, this is Jamal, he's one of the interns here, right?" Gary's smile turned tight, but he nodded. Oh yeah, Jamal, of course, he's been around. David raised an eyebrow, his expression interested but neutral. Tell me about him, how's he doing? Gary's smirk deepened slightly, and Jamal braced himself. He knew Gary couldn't resist the opportunity to throw a few subtle jabs, especially with his confidence still riding high from the board meeting. Well, Gary began, his tone light but condescending. Jamal's been doing okay. I mean, you know how these interns are, they try hard, but it's a steep learning curve for some of them. He glanced sideways at Jamal, a smug glint in his eye. Not everyone's cut out for this kind of work, you know. David nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful but unreadable. I see, has he had any issues? Gary shrugged, clearly enjoying himself. Nothing major, but you know how it is, some people need a little more guidance. They're not always equipped with the same skills as others when they come in. Takes a bit more time to, catch up. Jamal felt his blood boil. He had heard this kind of thing from Gary before, the thinly veiled insinuations, the subtle jabs at his competence, all layered with just enough plausible deniability to avoid outright confrontation. But this time it was different. This time his father was standing right there, watching. Jamal clenched his jaw, deciding that he wasn't going to let it slide this time. He had stayed quiet for long enough. With all due respect, Gary, Jamal said, his voice steady but firm, I've done the work you've asked for on time and without issue. If there are problems, they're not because I'm not equipped, they're because you keep creating unnecessary obstacles. Gary's smile froze, his eyes narrowing as he turned to Jamal. The friendly facade cracked, and his irritation slipped through. Watch yourself, Jamal, Gary said, his voice low in warning. You don't want to get ahead of yourself here. I've been patient, but you've got a lot to learn. Jamal met Gary's gaze, refusing to back down. I've learned a lot. I've learned that some people think they can get away with saying whatever they want as long as they dress it up in polite language. The air in the hallway went still. Gary's face reddened with barely concealed rage, his composure slipping further. He turned to David, a forced laugh escaping his lips. You hear this? The kid's got some nerve. He's got a lot of potential, sure, but sometimes they need to be reminded of their place. Jamal's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He could see Gary trying to regain control of the situation, but it wasn't working. Jamal had called him out in front of the CEO, and now Gary was scrambling to maintain his dominance. David remained silent, his expression calm, though his eyes flicked briefly to Jamal, signaling that he was paying close attention. Gary, emboldened by the silence, leaned in toward Jamal, his voice barely above a whisper. You better be careful, kid. You might think you've got something to prove, but you're not as smart as you think you are. Jamal's pulse quickened, but he refused to show any fear. I know exactly what I'm doing. The tension between them was palpable, and for a moment, it felt like the whole office had stopped to watch the exchange. Gary's face was flushed with anger, his carefully constructed mask of professionalism slipping away. He glanced back at David, searching for some kind of support, but David said nothing. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. Gary stood there, fuming, while Jamal kept his gaze locked on him, unflinching. Finally, David broke the silence with a calm but deliberate voice. Interesting. Gary blinked, his confusion evident. David's face remained expressionless, but his voice carried a subtle weight. This whole conversation has been interesting. I'm sure we'll have more to discuss later. Gary, still flustered, tried to regain his composure. Of course, Mr. Lawson, I'll be sure to. David raised a hand, cutting him off. That'll be all for now, Gary. Gary opened his mouth to speak, but quickly closed it again, clearly unsure of what had just transpired. He gave a stiff nod and turned to leave, his footsteps heavy as he walked away, the tension still hanging in the air. Jamal stood there, heart pounding in his chest, feeling the weight of what had just happened. David looked at Jamal, his face still calm, but with a slight glint in his eyes. Good work today, Jamal. Go home and get some rest. Jamal nodded, grateful for the brief but meaningful exchange. He turned and walked away, the tension in his shoulders slowly easing as he left the building. He knew the next time he faced Gary, everything would change. The truth was about to come out, and when it did, Gary wouldn't know what hit him. The tension in the office was palpable as Jamal received the message summoning him to the CEO's office. Gary had been strutting around with his usual smug confidence, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Jamal, however, knew this was the moment everything would come to light. At 11 a.m. sharp, Jamal walked toward the CEO's office. As he approached, he saw Gary standing outside the door, his expression smug but with a hint of confusion, as if he wasn't entirely sure what this meeting was about. Jamal felt a knot in his stomach, but he kept his composure, determined to stay calm. The assistant opened the door, motioning them in. Jamal and Gary stepped into David Lawson's office, the large, imposing space making the tension even more intense. David sat behind his desk, his face unreadable. He gestured for both men to sit. Jamal took a seat quietly, while Gary settled in, shifting uncomfortably as he glanced between Jamal and David. "Thank you both for coming," David began, his voice calm but firm. He looked directly at Gary, his gaze sharp. "There are some issues we need to address today." Gary sat up a little straighter, putting on his best professional demeanor. "Of course, Mr. Lawson, whatever you need." David's eyes flicked to Jamal for a brief second before turning to Gary. "Gary, you've worked with Jamal during his internship, correct?" Gary nodded quickly, clearly unsure of where the conversation was headed. "Yes, Jamal's one of the interns I've been overseeing." David's expression remained neutral. "And how would you say he's performed under your supervision?" Gary forced a tight smile. He's doing his best. There's been a learning curve, of course. Some interns take longer to adjust, especially in high-pressure environments like ours." David nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. And do you believe Jamal has the potential to succeed here?" Gary hesitated, the question catching him off guard. He glanced at Jamal, his lips curling slightly. "Well, Mr. Lawson, to be honest, I've had to give him a bit more attention than the others. He's needed more guidance. It's clear that he doesn't come from the same kind of background as some of the others." David's face remained unreadable, but Jamal could feel the tension thickening in the room. He knew exactly what Gary meant by background. "So you're saying Jamal has struggled more than the other interns?" David asked, his voice even. Gary leaned forward slightly, eager to solidify his narrative. "Yes, I tried to be patient with him, but, well, not everyone is cut out for this kind of work. Some people, they just aren't built for it, you know." The subtle racism hung in the air, and Jamal's patience finally snapped. He looked directly at Gary, his voice steady but firm. "I've done the work you've assigned on time and without issue. Any problems I've had have come from you trying to sabotage me, not from my abilities." Gary's face twisted with irritation, and for the first time, his professional mask slipped. "Excuse me?" "You've been undermining me since day one," Jamal continued, his voice strong. "You've made it clear that you don't think I belong here, and now you're trying to spin it like I'm the problem." Gary's eyes flared with anger, his fists clenching slightly. He turned to David, his voice rising. "Mr. Lawson, this is ridiculous. This kid is trying to set me up. He's been playing the victim this whole time, and now he's accusing me of..." David raised a hand, his voice cutting through Gary's outburst. "Gary, calm down." But Gary wasn't done, his face reddened, and he turned back to Jamal, his words sharp and venomous. "You think you're smart, don't you? You think you can walk in here and play the race card? I should have expected this from someone like you." Jamal's chest tightened, but he refused to back down. "What's that supposed to mean?" Gary sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You know exactly what I mean. This is what you people do, set people like me up, try to make us look like the bad guys, and you," he pointed accusingly at Jamal, "you've been planning this the whole time, haven't you?" Jamal stared at him, his heart pounding, but his expression remained calm. "You did this to yourself, Gary." Gary's eyes flashed with rage, and he turned to David, desperate now. "Mr. Lawson, you can't believe this. He's been trying to get me fired from the start. This was all a setup." David finally leaned forward, his voice cold and steady. "Gary, I've been watching, I've seen everything, and what you've done, how you've treated Jamal, the things you've said, has been unacceptable." Gary's face went white, the realization dawned on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "And there's one more thing you should know," David continued, his voice slicing through the silence. "Jamal is my son." The room went dead silent. Gary's eyes widened, his face twisting in disbelief and horror. "Your son?" David nodded slowly. "Yes, my son, the intern you've been belittling, bullying, and harassing for weeks." Gary's hands trembled, his face a mix of rage and panic. "I didn't know, I swear. If I had known, it shouldn't have mattered," David said, his voice low and firm. "It shouldn't matter whether he's my son or not. No one should be treated the way you've treated Jamal." Gary sat there, completely deflated, his mouth hanging open as if he still couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. He looked back at Jamal, his eyes narrowing in bitter anger. "You set me up." Jamal met his gaze, his voice steady. "I didn't set you up, you did this all on your own." Gary's face flushed with fury. I should have known, I should have expected this from a David stood, his voice cutting Gary off mid-sentence. That's enough, Gary. Gary's words died on his lips as he looked up at David, his fear now fully taking over. He tried to speak again, but David's cold stare silenced him. You're done here, Gary, David said, his tone final. Pack up your things, you're no longer a part of this company. Gary's face twisted with desperation, but he knew there was no way out. He stood shakily, casting one last venomous glance at Jamal before turning to leave. His footsteps echoed in the now silent office as he walked out, defeated. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the weight of everything that had just happened settled over the room. David turned to Jamal, his expression softening slightly. You handled that well. Jamal nodded, feeling both exhausted and relieved. Thanks, Dad. David walked over to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. This wasn't easy, I know, but now it's over, you've proven yourself. Jamal looked at his father, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. I just wanted to do it on my own. And you did, David said, his voice full of quiet pride. You've earned your place here. Jamal nodded again, feeling the weight of everything lift from his shoulders. Gary was gone, the truth was out, and now Jamal could finally move forward. The long game was over, and Jamal had won. The following week at Summit Solutions Group felt different. Gary's abrupt departure had left a noticeable void in the office, one filled with whispers and curious glances. No one spoke directly to Jamal about what had happened, but the shift in the way people treated him was undeniable. There was respect now, a quiet acknowledgement of everything he had endured and proven. Jamal felt lighter, as though a heavy burden had finally been lifted. Jamal sat at his desk, reviewing a report with a calm focus he hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, he wasn't looking over his shoulder, waiting for Gary's sneering comments or subtle sabotage. He was free to work in peace, his competence and intelligence shining through without anyone trying to undermine him. Later that day, Jamal found himself in his father's office again, this time under far more relaxed circumstances. David stood by the window, looking out over the city with a pensive expression. Jamal entered quietly, waiting for his father to speak. How do you feel? David finally asked, turning to face him. Jamal took a breath, considering the question carefully. Relieved, he admitted, but also ready. David raised an eyebrow. Ready? Yeah, Jamal continued, his voice steady, ready to take on whatever comes next. I spent a lot of time dealing with Gary, proving that I could handle this. Now I just want to move forward and focus on the work, on actually making a difference here. David nodded, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. You've proven more than enough, Jamal. You handled yourself with integrity, even when it wasn't easy. Jamal met his father's gaze, feeling the warmth of his approval. I just wanted to earn my place. And you did, David replied, stepping closer. You've earned your place here, not just because you're my son, but because you've shown the qualities of a true leader. I'm proud of you. Jamal smiled, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying suddenly lifting. Thanks, Dad. David placed a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his expression serious but kind. Now it's time to look ahead. You have a future in this company, Jamal, a bright one, and I have no doubt that you'll make it your own. Jamal nodded, feeling a sense of certainty he hadn't had before. For the first time, the path ahead felt clear. Meanwhile, Gary Thompson was a shadow of the man he once was. The humiliation of being fired in front of the CEO and his colleagues had shattered whatever confidence he had left. His life, once full of arrogance and entitlement, had come crashing down around him. Sitting in the small, cluttered apartment he had rented after leaving the company, Gary stared blankly at the television. The news of his departure had spread quickly throughout the industry, and any hopes he had of landing another high-profile job were quickly evaporating. People didn't forget how you treated others, especially when those actions came back to bite you. He spent his days bitter, replaying the events in his mind. How had he not known? How had he been so stupid to not realize Jamal's connection to David Lawson? He had spent so much time trying to bully and belittle Jamal, only to discover too late that the young man had far more power than Gary had ever imagined. But as the days went on, that bitterness transformed into something else, regret. For the first time, Gary found himself thinking about the things he had said, the way he had treated not just Jamal, but others over the years. He had built his career on tearing others down, convinced that his way was the only way to succeed, and now he had nothing to show for it. Gary didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew one thing: his time as a bully had cost him everything. Back at the office, Jamal stood by the window of his father's office, looking out at the city below. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the skyline. He felt a sense of peace that had been absent for a long time. "Ready to head out?" David asked, stepping up beside him. Jamal nodded, feeling a deep sense of accomplishment. "Yeah, I am." As they left the office together, walking side by side, Jamal couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. The path ahead was wide open, and now, without the weight of proving himself to those who didn't believe in him, he could focus on what truly mattered, building something meaningful, not just for himself, but for others like him. Gary's downfall had been inevitable, but Jamal's rise was just beginning, and this time, no one could stop him. Months had passed since Gary Thompson's abrupt firing from Summit Solutions Group, but for him, the time felt like a slow, torturous blur. Every day was the same: waking up in his small, dreary apartment, sending out resumes, and receiving nothing but silence or curt rejections. The once proud regional manager who had walked through the halls of a high-profile corporate firm with his head held high was now a man whose reputation had been tainted beyond repair. No one in the industry would touch him. Word had spread quickly about his disgraceful exit, and worse, the details about his behavior had followed him like a shadow, staining every application he submitted. Gary was no longer seen as a confident leader; he was now the man who had crossed the wrong line, exposed for his toxic behavior toward a powerful CEO's son. Gary sat hunched over his phone, staring at the contact list. His hand hovered over one name: David Lawson, the one man who could still turn things around for him. If he could just get David to give him a reference, just a word of support, it might be enough to get him back on his feet. Desperation gnawed at him, but his pride held him back until now. He took a deep breath and pressed the call button. The phone rang once, twice, and then David answered, his voice calm and controlled as always. "David Lawson speaking." Gary's throat tightened for a moment; he couldn't speak, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed what he would say, but now that the moment had come, the words were stuck. "Gary?" David's voice prompted. Yes, Mr. Lawson, it's me." Gary's voice sounded small, weaker than he had ever heard it before. David paused for a moment before speaking again. "What can I do for you, Gary?" There was no warmth in his tone, just the cool professionalism that had always defined David. Gary felt the weight of it, a reminder of how far he had fallen. I need your help," Gary finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. "I've been trying to find work, any work, but no one will hire me. I've applied everywhere, and they either ignore me or tell me I'm not a good fit." David remained silent on the other end, waiting for Gary to continue. Gary felt his throat tighten again, but he pushed forward, the desperation clear in his voice. "I know I made mistakes," Gary said, his words coming out faster now, his facade of control slipping. "I know I crossed lines I shouldn't have, but I've learned from it, I swear I have. I just need another chance, something to get back on my feet." He paused, gathering the last shred of his pride before continuing. "I was hoping, maybe you could give me a reference, just something so they know I'm not that guy anymore." The silence on the other end was deafening. Gary's heart raced as he waited for David's response. He couldn't believe he had been reduced to this, begging the very man whose son he had bullied for a way back into the world he had been so eager to dominate. Finally, David spoke, his voice cold and measured as ever. "You want me to give you a reference, Gary?" Gary winced at the question, knowing how pitiful he sounded. "Yes, please, I know I don't deserve it, but without one, I don't have a chance. I need this, Mr. Lawson." David was silent again, but Gary could almost hear the wheels turning in his mind. When David finally spoke, his voice was laced with a quiet intensity that made Gary's stomach drop. "You're right about one thing, Gary," David said, "you don't deserve it." Gary's breath hitched, but he stayed silent, knowing that interrupting would only make things worse. "The way you treated Jamal, my son, was reprehensible," David continued. "You undermined him, bullied him, and said things I won't soon forget. You should have been fired long before you were." Gary clenched the phone, feeling his grip tighten as his last hope began to slip away. "I'll do anything," he whispered, "please." There was a long pause, and for a brief moment, Gary thought he might have gotten through, but when David spoke again, his voice was calm, final. "You made your bed, Gary," David said quietly, "now you have to lie in it." The line clicked, and the call ended. Gary sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. His last chance, his one hope for redemption, had just been ripped away. The reality of his situation hit him like a sledgehammer, and for the first time, Gary realized that there was no easy way out of this. His actions had consequences, consequences he had never truly understood until now. He dropped the phone onto the table, his hands shaking. There would be no glowing reference from David Lawson, no easy return to the life he once had. The world had moved on without him, and now Gary was left to pick up the pieces of the life he had destroyed with his own arrogance alone. He sank into the couch, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like never before. He had played the game for years, but in the end, it had caught up to him, and now there was nothing left. It was a quiet afternoon in David Lawson's office when he called Jamal in for a meeting. The sun filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow over the polished wood of his desk. Jamal entered with a relaxed smile, feeling more confident and settled in his role than ever before. The months since Gary's departure had been transformative, not just for the company, but for Jamal personally. He had stepped into his position with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that he had earned his place. David leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. "How's everything going, Jamal?" Jamal nodded, taking his seat across from him. "Pretty well, actually. We're making progress with the new projects, and the team is finally hitting its stride." David gave a nod of approval. "I've been hearing good things. You've done a remarkable job." Jamal smiled, but there was something in his father's tone that made him raise an eyebrow. "What's up, Dad? You sound like you've got something on your mind." David chuckled lightly. "I do, it's about Gary." Jamal's expression shifted slightly. He hadn't thought about Gary in a while, not since the man had been fired and disappeared from the company's orbit. David leaned forward, his expression softening. "He called me a few days ago, begging for a reference." Jamal's eyes widened in surprise. "You're kidding." David shook his head. "No, he was desperate, said no one would hire him without one. He sounded like a broken man." Jamal frowned slightly, the memory of Gary's venomous words still fresh in his mind. "What did you say?" David smiled, though there was a hint of seriousness in his voice. "I told him no. I told him that he had made his bed, and now he had to lie in it." Jamal sat back, letting the weight of his father's words sink in. There was something oddly satisfying about knowing that the man who had tried so hard to tear him down was now facing the consequences of his actions. "Wow," Jamal said quietly, shaking his head. "I can't believe he had the nerve to ask." David chuckled again. "People like Gary always do. They think they can escape the consequences if they just say the right things. But I wasn't going to let him walk away from what he did, not after everything." Jamal nodded, a sense of closure washing over him. "I guess that's the end of that." David's expression softened further, a proud glint in his eyes. "It is, and it's because of how you handled yourself, Jamal. You could have lashed out, you could have made it messy, but you didn't. You let your work and your integrity speak for you." Jamal smiled, feeling a swell of pride. "Thanks, Dad." David stood, walking over to his son and placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've proven yourself in more ways than one, Jamal, and I couldn't be more proud of the man you've become." Jamal looked up at his father, feeling the weight of his words. There was no longer any doubt about his place in the company or in the world. He had faced the challenges head-on, overcome them with grace, and now he was stronger for it. "Thanks," Jamal said, standing as well. "I wouldn't have gotten here without your support." David smiled warmly. "It's been a pleasure watching you grow, Jamal. I know there's much more ahead for you." As they both stood there, side by side, looking out at the city skyline, Jamal felt a deep sense of contentment. The future was wide open, and with the weight of the past behind him, he was ready for whatever came next. The long game was over, and Jamal had emerged victorious, not just in the office, but in life. The chapter of Gary Thompson was closed. The future was Jamal's to write. Subscribe to Dark Threads for more stories like this.